This next episode is going to feature Dr. Mark Merlin, who's a professor of botany. He teaches ethnobotany at the University of Hawaii. And his research has focused on the roles of plants around the world, as well as in the Pacific Islands. He's mostly focused on the uses of psychoactive plants. He's looked at the biogeography of culturally important plants and has done quite a bit of really solid work in the parts of Micronesia, Marshall Islands and Palau and Federated States of Micronesia, as well as other parts of the Pacific. He's well known for his contributions in the journal Economic Botany. He's also known for his contributions in the book Kava, the Pacific Drug. And so without further ado, Mark will present his talk to us on psychoactive plants.
Thank you very much, Will. Today I'm going to talk to you about a subject that we'll call plants of the gods. This refers to the traditional use of plants pretty much all around the world among traditional societies. Many of these societies have disappeared. Some still exist, especially in very rural areas or remote areas like the parts of the Amazon or in parts of northeastern Siberia, where the inroads of civilization and modern society haven't had as much effect. But the concept of plants of the gods relates to the shaman use of particular species of plants that have substances that will allow an individual to transcend normal reality, and through the cognitive interpretation of the individual taking this, the shaman or individuals who are going to communicate with the spirit world, that this altered state of consciousness will allow them to speak with their ancestors, essentially the gods. This is a pan-global tradition which I'd like to talk to you about and present some of my ideas and some of the generally known facts and theories about this concept of human use of psychoactive substances to communicate with the spirit world. First thing I'd like to refer to is a simple formula for determining the effect of a drug on a human being. Let's have a simple formula. A plus B plus C equals X. A equals the drug quality and quantity. The drug itself, how much and how strong of an effect will this particular substance or drug have. And we're talking now about plant material without the extraction of, say, alkaloids or other chemicals through modern chemistry. Second, B equals the set. The set, S-E-T, refers to the psychological state of a human being. And that is the state that individual is in. An individual might be very calm and relaxed, he might be excited, he might be depressed, he or she might be very much in a relatively abnormal condition based on their normal state. So the set is very important for an individual and how the drug will react. C would equal the setting, the environment which you or the individual consumes a psychoactive substance. For example, in one's home in a safe environment would be radically different than if the ingestion of this substance took place in an uncomfortable environment, in a large crowd, among people that are unfamiliar, in a naturally threatening environment or a culturally threatening environment. So together, the drug itself, quantity and quality, the set, the psychological condition of the individual, and C, the setting or the environment. These together will equal essentially X, the actual experience of ingesting a psychoactive substance. In traditional societies, this is very important. The psychological set must be in an appropriate condition for that individual, and the environment also appropriate. and then the right amount of the substance to allow, whether it's the shaman or the individual that the shaman is guiding towards his mental or even physical health, or in communicating with one's or the group's ancestors in order to understand social behavior, divining what will happen in the future, understanding the nature of reality, and the things in which connect the philosophy and thoughts of a particular society from one generation to another. For example, to relate this to modern philosophy, there was one of the great 20th century philosophers, Alfred North Whitehead, who said that transcendence of mere clarity and order is necessary for dealing with the unforeseen, for progress, for excitement. Life degenerates when enclosed within the shackles of mere confirmation. The power of incorporating vague and disorderly elements of experience is essential for the advance into novelty. This Alfred North Whitehead wrote in 1938. One recent study of 488 societies indicates that approximately 90% have institutionalized an altered state of consciousness into their religious framework. 90% of well over 400, almost 500 societies that were sampled through Human Area Relations Fund literature or actual field research by anthropologists. And so this is a strong evidence that the altered state of consciousness is an important part of traditional society in explaining life after death, their interpretation of the spirit world, and a major element in altering the state of consciousness has been, for thousands of years, those plants that have alkaloids or other substances that alter consciousness, that are essentially psychoactive. A large percentage of the altered states are produced through the consumption of psychoactive plant substances. Traditionally, the use of the great majority of psychoactive drug plants has been tightly tied to both ritual and religious activity. Motivations for ingestion have indeed been predominantly dictated by spiritual or medicinal requirement. We have to look, on the other hand, that contemporary use in various societies of the Pacific, as in many other parts of the world, especially in those areas affected by Western civilization, this use in contemporary societies of psychoactive substances is often inspired by a personal desire to experience euphoria, and frequently is impelled by peer group pressure. Peer group pressure, where one's peers put the pressure on the individual to follow a particular trend, to indulge in a substance, whether it be illegal or legal. For example, substances that are illegal, such as cannabis, or legal, such as alcohol, although there are restraints on even the legal drugs in terms of age and where one substance or another can be consumed. What I'd like to do then is give you now an overview of plants of the gods, those species that have been used traditionally by societies to communicate with their ancestors. What you see here in this slide is a cartoon. Hey, what is this stuff? It makes everything I think seem profound. Well, it's a joke in one sense, but is essentially the discovery of substances by earlier societies, and then the interpretation of those visions which were abnormal, were altered states of consciousness. And these often have been interpreted as visiting with ancestors, moving into realms that cannot be perceived under what we call normal perception or normal reality. So what I'd like to talk about is the global phenomena of this plants of the gods use by shaman or so-called medicine men throughout the world, the deep time depth of this phenomenon, all the way back into the Paleolithic, in other words, well before farming, when all people on earth only were hunters and gatherers and perhaps fishermen. And then the roots of religion, which very well, at least in some, if not many or most societies, can probably be found in the psychoactive state. And I should say at this point that the psychoactive state is not entirely and in every location induced by the use of a plant substance. In fact, there are a few animal substances or substances that are derived from animals that can induce highly potent altered states of consciousness. But it is overwhelmingly plant substances with their alkaloids and other kinds of chemicals that produce the altered state. But these aren't the only way that individuals today or in the past or in the future have altered their state. There are other forms without the use of external materials, such as plant materials, such as fasting, such as meditation, other forms of what are called in India yoga, or a union of the mind with, of an individual with the all-encompassing reality, or transcending reality to identify with the oneness of the universe in the case of some Eastern religions. And this can be done by various forms of, as I mentioned, meditation or yoga, but also in traditional societies, prehistorically, and even in today in some remote areas, is definitely done with the use of psychoactive substances. Herbs, materials from shrubs, even trees, even vines, and also beyond the plant kingdom, in the kingdom of the fungi, there are species that are very potent. As many people know from the illicit recreational use of substances, but traditionally the use of mushrooms in some societies, sometimes referred to as the flesh of the gods, were in a sense organic materials used to communicate with ancestors in the spirit world. In this research, let me point out that some of the most important people, the pioneers in this research, and at least in the 20th century, some of the most important figures included Dr. Richard Evans Schultes, the late professor of botany and the chair of the botany department at Harvard University, who was an undergrad and then a graduate student there, and then for his whole career was a professor there, who had many students who've gone on to become very well known globally in terms of from herbal medicine to conservation to discovery of psychoactive substances and identification of things like the substances involved in creating zombies in the voodoo the concepts of, say, Haiti. So Dr. Schultes, who spent well over 10 years in the Amazon, visiting many tribal groups and recording their plant uses. In particular, he specialized in identifying use of hevea species, or plants that produce natural rubber, but he's much more well known for his research of psychoactive substances, in particular the so-called hallucinogens that create profound changes in perception, and that so many different societies which he visited, what is often referred to by, from modern societal points of view as primitive societies, but societies in remote parts of the Colombian Amazon, for example, that utilized a variety of different things, like the vine known as ayahuasca, ka'ape, or yahe, Banisteriopsis species, or resins from the bark or parts of the trunk of the Varroa trees, or a variety of other plants like those in the Solanaceous species that have different kinds of alkaloids. And Dr. Schultes was a key person in the study of this and promoting the need to research this aspect of our traditional ethnobotany worldwide, and the near universal concept of the use of plants to communicate with ancestors. He teamed up with the world-famous chemist Albert Hofmann, who serendipitously discovered the incredibly powerful substance we now know as lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD, number 25 in the series, which he accidentally ingested and discovered this substance, of which the history following that is, of course, well known and to a degree notorious. But Dr. Hofmann, who was a very well-respected scientist, became interested in the profound changes in perception that certain chemicals can do. And he worked as a chemist with Dr. Schultes to produce the book, The Plants of the Gods, and the much more rigorous scholarly book on botanical and chemical aspects of psychoactive substances. Other individuals who were friends of Schultes and Hoffman included R. Gordon Wasson, who was an amateur mycologist or student of mushrooms, who had been a successful banker and financier, who married a Russian woman who was a doctor, and her love for mushrooms and his fear of mushrooms combined for a lifelong love affair, not only between themselves but also in the discovery of the use of mushrooms. He is credited with helping alert or open the eyes of the rest of the world to the long-term traditional use of psilocybin mushrooms in rural parts still today in Mexico, and also with his well-known theory that the ancient and extremely important soma drug of traditional India, of the ancient Vedas, wasn't, as he put it, most likely a Amanita muscaria, a large red-capped, well-known mushroom in a genus of mushrooms that include some very deadly mushrooms, I might add. In any case, when we look around the world, we'll see that there is a disparity among the known traditional use of plants to communicate with the gods or the ancestors. Overwhelmingly, the great majority of these have been discovered, have been cataloged and studied by ethnobotanists, anthropologists, cultural geographers, and others in the New World. In Central America, essentially mostly in Mexico, some parts of Central America, and largely in the Amazon or in South America. Much more so than in the Old World. This is interesting, and in a rhetorical question, Dr. Schultes asked a well-known anthropologist from Duke at the time, Weston LaBarre, in a classic article in Economic Botany. And Dr. Schultes asked the question, why is it that so many of the plants in the Old World has more species of plants than the New World? It has greater size and perhaps more diversity of environments, taking Africa and Eurasia into account. But there's so many fewer known traditional societies that use these drug plants to communicate with the gods. And Dr. LaBarre answered essentially in this way. In the Old World, monotheism, including the religions that come from Abraham, such as Judaism and Christianity and Islam, and to a large degree some of the other large religions, including Hinduism, and out of which comes Buddhism, these religions have essentially, if not frowned on, have wiped out the use, suppressed the use of traditional so-called paganistic rites. But these can still be found in fragments in the Shinto religion, for example, of Japan, which now shares with Buddhism as the most important religions of Japan. And in Shinto rites there are cloth that involves cannabis fibers, rope cannabis fibers, that harks back to the perhaps ritual use of cannabis, even in that society, as well as in Korea or in China. Only recently there have been findings of cannabis in a shaman funeral tomb in remote northwest China, dating 2,500 years old. And this material has been positively identified in very excellent shape, a remarkable find of cannabis in a bag left for a shaman in his tomb. But this evidence fits up with evidence found further to the west in Central Asia of cannabis found in frozen tombs of nomads like the Scythians who roamed the broad steppes of Eurasia, also approximately 2,500 years ago. But the use of cannabis and many other psychoactive substances goes way back. Much of this probably was wiped out by the spread of monotheistic religions. And that helps explain why there's a difference in the number of known use of psychoactive substances. Some areas are also less studied than others for this particular use, such as places like Africa, where also the spread of Christianity and Islam have suppress the use of traditional substances. You can still find in an area where Christianity or Islam has not taken over, in an area of parts of tropical West Africa, where the use of a plant in the Apocynaceae family, Iboga, tabernanthe, is still used to communicate with the ancestors in a rite of passage of young men, and is a crucial plant which is used and is supports this particular traditional religious viewpoint, and one of the ways in which the people who utilize this plant have been able to not be overcome by the spread of these monotheistic religions from the Near East over time. So I'd like to then give you, I've already given you some, but some archaeological evidence for the pan-global tradition of psychoactive use. Archaeological evidence includes artifact representations, and this means identification and interpretation of artifact representations, paleobotanical remains such as macrofossils, such as seeds, microfossils such as pollen, and then dating these artifact representations of drug plant substances or parts of plants, and the context in which the seeds themselves or the material in which they're found, along with the pollen, dating these for historical and through often radiocarbon analysis in the case of the paleobotanical remains. So let's go to some examples from the Old World. First of all, let's talk about the Mediterranean region. If we go back to the ancient Greek civilization, we can see representations of the goddess of agriculture, Demeter. She's often shown holding sheaves of grain, cereal if you will, and also the capsules of opium poppies. And this is a representation of her association with agriculture and the great cycle of agriculture, the ecology of ancient agriculture in the Mediterranean region. The famous myth or story of Demeter and her daughter Persephone. Persephone is stolen to the underworld by the god of the underworld. And Hades refuses to return this god, Persephone, to her mother, Demeter. Well, Demeter first doesn't know what happened to her, then finds out that she has been stolen away, and until she's returned, she does not allow agriculture to be fruitful. And eventually this causes much concern and dismay in the ancient Greek society. Eventually a bargain is made between Hades, who in fact is related to Demeter, that Hades will return her abducted daughter Persephone every springtime, symbolizing the rebirth or regrowth in the agricultural system, or in the natural system as well. And Persephone then can come back to life in this world, but has to return to Hades in the autumn, in the fall, when winter begins. And that return is celebrated in the Great Harvest Festival. And you see the cycle here that is manifested in this myth of rebirth, growth, harvest, and then return to the soil. It's interesting too that the grain is planted consciously, and the grains of cereals such as wheat and barley are tiny, relatively small grains, but much smaller are the seeds of the opium poppy. And these are natural weedy plants in grassy or open areas. And so when people would collect, if there were opium poppy capsules and their small seeds would get collected with the grains in the harvest time, and in a sense be contaminate the bags of grain that would be saved and then planted in the springtime. And when these would then be spread out over the fields, the grains of wheat and or barley would have within them opium poppies, without perhaps the knowledge of the people who were spreading the seeds. And miraculously then, along with the cereal grains, would rise the opium poppy. And this poppy was known to have been used for relieving pain, and a very, very important role in the Greek culture, but well before that, perhaps in communicating, as Demeter would have, with in the spirit world. So there's an interesting use of a psychoactive substance that's related to the religious myth and its relationship to the agricultural communities of the ancient Mediterranean region. More interesting is perhaps we go back just before the Greeks. There was a society known as the Minoan Society, and this society that honored a female goddess in particular, and we see some evidences of this. For example, in Crete, a 3,500-year-old tomb was examined, and about 100 years ago, inside in a subterranean chamber was found a statue of a goddess figure, very much like those found elsewhere in the Mediterranean, dated to about the same time, 3,500 years. This is about 1,000 years before, let's say, the Demeter myth in traditional classical Greece. And this goddess with her upraised hands, as you see in the cover of the Economic Botany article, cover article that I wrote, is a picture that I took in the museum in Archaeological in Crete. And this about 1 meter high terracotta or clay statue with the upraised hands, and you look at the eyes in a trance-like state. In this statue was found in a subterranean sensory deprivation chamber, as I'll refer to it, along with a clay unit with holes in it that was designed to burn, and a metal plate that was also found in there, to burn some substance and be able to draft in air so that fumes would rise from this burned substance, which presumably was the sap from the opium poppy. The opium poppy can be slit when it's unripe, and a white oozing latex will collect on the outside, which can then be scraped as the ancient Greeks did. Or in fact, you could soak the poppy capsule alone in water for a mild opiate-rich, morphine and codeine-rich decoction. But the opium sap itself, when it coagulates and then turns dark brown, could be, if it's heated up and vaporized, the rising smoke could be inhaled and used to communicate with the ancestors. So these things were found together in this deprivation chamber in ancient Crete. Some hundreds of miles to the east, on the island of Cyprus, in the same time frame, about 3,500 years ago, in another temple structure, in another kind of sensory deprivation chamber, similar evidence of a clay vessel used to allow air to draft in and to burn some substance was found, almost identical to the one in Crete, along with a necklace of carnelian beads. And these beads, some of these carnelian beads, as you can see in the picture, are in the shape of the opium poppy, representing perhaps the use of this special substance in a Eastern Mediterranean or perhaps pan-Mediterranean use of the poppy, not only for medicine but also perhaps for communicating with the ancestors. It is interesting that macrofossils of opium poppies and capsules have been found in the famous lakeshore dwellers around the shores in northern Switzerland. Many lakes, shores had settlements for some hundreds of years of people who were farmers and also did some hunting and gathering. And in the remains in the muds of the lake have been recovered the macrofossils of poppy seeds and poppy capsules. And in fact, the opium poppy remnants can be found throughout the Mediterranean region now, with some remarkable finds in a bowl of poppy seeds in a lake about 20 miles north of Rome that dates back 7,000 years. That was on the cover of Discovery magazine about a year ago. And the archaeologists that study this area have suggested that this is one of the earliest direct evidence of agriculture in this part of the world, and it also involved the use of the opium poppies, which would of course been a source of vegetal fat and food. As we know, the opium poppy is used as a condiment and as a food essentially, but also for medicine and I would argue probably also for the alkaloid-rich contents of the capsules for psychoactive alteration to communicate with the ancestors. Now I want to tell you about a very special find that goes back about 35 years ago or more. In northern Iraq, there's a cave named Shanandar, or a cave complex. And Ralph Selecki, an anthropologist, who wrote a book called, then it was relevant, he called it The First Flower People. Well, this cave was a cave, included burials of what are now known as Homo neanderthalensis by many anthropologists or archaeologists, physical anthropologists. Neanderthal people. And these burials have been found various places in Europe and in the Near East, or in Eurasia. And they were often found buried in flex burials, flex position, and oriented in the same direction. This shows some sensitivity in the burial, often with some objects placed in there. So because at this time in the late 60s, there was a rise of interest in a variety of new techniques in archaeology, including paleobotanical aspects. So what he did was collect soil samples from around the grave, and he mapped these collections around the grave, and then he sent these soil samples to Paris to a well-known palynologist, or a person who studies pollen. And this woman, well-known in her field, studied the soil samples carefully and came back with the information to Dr. Selecki and said, this is very interesting because what you have here is the distribution of pollen. There's definitely pollen in here, and what's remarkable is the pollen are in groups of this from the same species distributed around the grave. Now, if pollen had blown in there naturally, it would have fallen randomly, as assuming uniformity of process, wind blowing the pollen, and not into clumps. The best interpretation is that people had placed flowers or plants that would produce the pollen in groups, in bunches around the grave. That in itself is remarkable, the first flower people. And these were not Homo sapiens, but Homo neanderthalensis, or Neanderthal people. Some, by the way, categorize these people as a subspecies of humans, Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. But I think DNA is suggesting that there, in fact, were a unique species closely related to us that disappeared some roughly 30,000 years ago. This particular cave is dated 50,000 years ago. People burying their loved ones in a particular way and then honoring them by bringing flowers to the grave. And most of you watching here know that you have perhaps done this for some of your relatives. As cemeteries today are often filled with or replenished with flower offerings to deceased loved ones. There's a sensitivity here of the people involved. Now, what's remarkable from our point of view of psychoactive drug plants and plants of the gods is that, first of all, 7 of the 8 species that were identified by the pollen analysis are plants that have medicinal values still today by traditional people in the northern Iraq area. And one of the plants in particular is a species in the genus Ephedra, ephedrine. This is a unique plant in the Coniferaceae or cone-bearing family, but it's not your typical cone-bearing tree. It's a shrub, and very common genus of plants found throughout Eurasia and in North America in the dry, high desert areas, like in Iraq all the way to Central Asia, for example. Now, ephedra has ephedrine in it, which is often considered, rightly so, as an alkaloid, which is a stimulant. And of course, there's many modern uses and abuses of this from people using it as a stimulant for a variety of reasons, including athletes using it perhaps inappropriately. But in the context of the plant, this stimulant in large doses with the right set and setting could perhaps alter consciousness. And so therefore, this plant, which would have had medicinal value, but perhaps also spiritual value, if we can interpret it that way, was placed around the grave. of Shanidar 50,000 years ago. So that's a very unique and interesting insight to the antiquity, the age in which humans have been associated with medicinal plants, that's for sure. And by the way, we can interpret based on the species of plants, the flowers that produce the pollen that only bloom seasonally in the summer. And so by studying the bones of the man and the pollen, we assume this was a man in his early 20s who was died and was buried in perhaps June or July in northern Iraq. And we know that by the kinds of pollen and when the plants would be flowering. Remarkable find, and may in fact give us some insight to medicinal and psychoactive drug plant use. Let me give you a few other examples from the old world. We go to China and just for a moment discuss the ancient use of cannabis. Cannabis is a plant that's probably been used for 10,000 years, perhaps 20 or 30,000 years. The fiber from the cannabis plant is one of the world's most important natural fibers, hemp. The long fibrous cells, a bast type of fiber in the stalks of this large herb or herbaceous plant known as cannabis, the genus, one or more species, depending upon which taxonomist you talk with. So the plants also, not all of them, produce from small amounts to large amounts, relatively speaking, of a psychoactive substance that's not alkaloidal, a terpene-like substance known as tetrahydrocannabinol. And that alters consciousness, and in large doses in the right setting could be considered to be hallucinogenic or strongly mind-altering. This has probably been used for thousands of years as a medicine and as a ritual. And now we have direct evidence of its use. In fact, we've had evidence going back 100 years in Central Asian tombs, frozen tombs. The father of history, Herodotus, an ancient Greek, who is credited with being the first to try to verify information about past events in creating a history, therefore known as the father of history. And Herodotus spoke of these barbarians, if you will, to the north, or these nomadic people who rode their horses and milked their mares of their horses across the steppes of the Ukraine into Eastern Europe. But in fact, those steppes stretch all the way to Western China. And there was tribal groups that have been living there and where they hunted and then eventually first domesticated the horse, most likely. And in the process, these people, Herodotus said, when one of their chieftains died, after the funeral ceremonies, they would use metal poles, put some leather material around it, and inside of this would be a metal censer or a metal bowl in which coals would be placed, hot coals, and then cannabis or the flowers of the hemp plant would be placed on these coals, burned, and the Scythians would stick their heads inside these little tents and inhale the vapors and then howl in their vapor baths, as Herodotus spoke. Well, this indicates a purification rite or some association with the afterworld and their chieftain's funeral ceremony. The tombs that were found thousands of miles to the east in what's now eastern Russia, not so far from China, and investigated by the archaeologist Rudenko back some 85 years ago, identified in these frozen tombs not only the bodies of the chieftains and the horses that were sacrificed along with the chieftain and other implements, including metal censers or bowls in which coals, burned coals were, and the seed remains of cannabis, exactly like Herodotus had talked about similar types of nomadic horse herding tribal groups thousands of miles away in the western part of Asia. Recently, Chinese archaeologists have recovered from a northwest desert, very dry environment in China, in certain tombs, a series of remains. And in one of these tombs, in what they have identified as a shaman tomb, based on the implements, musical instrument, and other artifactual remains, they also found a container, a leather container, in which was 4/5 of a gram, 4/5 of a kilogram of cannabis remains. For the first time, not just seeds or pollen of cannabis, but actual shoots, leaves, fruits, intact, including the trichomes that secrete tetrahydrocannabinol and the non-glandular trichomes. All of this identified by botanists with light microscopes and electron microscopes, and have identified also the chemical composition, which still contains 2,500-year-old specimens from this tomb, tetrahydrocannabinol, in a shaman's tomb, indicating a ritual, perhaps religious use of this as a plant of the gods. There's much more evidence than this that tells us that cannabis had its ritual use as well as its fiber use, food use, and is a very interesting plant, like, for instance, the coconut as a multi-purpose plant. But that's another aspect of economic botany. Those plants that, as Carl Sauer said, the more uses a plant has, may be an indication of how long it's been used by humans. Or we could also say, certainly, how useful that individual species is. Let me come back to the opium poppy for a moment to give you still some more evidence on the opium poppy in ancient Near East and Eastern Mediterranean. It's quite remarkable. As you see in the picture, in the photographs shown here, there are these vessels that are perhaps a few inches high that were used to contain an unguent or an ointment. And we believe that ointment, there's now chemical residue evidence, contained opium. And these little containers are in the shape of an opium poppy. Just as today you can go in the market and buy a plastic lemon. It tells you immediately what's in that. And this would be the similar type of identification by shape of the object. And these were traded all over the Eastern Mediterranean about 3,500 years ago, sent from their major manufacturing area in Cyprus to places like the Near East, which is now Lebanon, and also down to Egypt, where they're found in tombs, and like the little statue of a boy who, this little implement with the carnelian beads in the shape of the opium poppy were found in an Egyptian burial of a young boy who died probably of dysentery or some stomach disorder, because he had pictured him with a bloated stomach, and the opium would have been either a medicine or a substance to help him into the afterworld, as a psychoactive substance to help him in his voyage to communicate with the gods, if you will. And so we're going to, I think, leave it at that for now, and I'll come back and pick it up later.